Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to Venable today. I know it's a cold day for those of you who braved the elements and joined us here. Unfortunately, not as cold here as it might be in other parts of the country right now, but appreciate you all coming. And for those of you that have dialed in, appreciate you all joining us over the phone. I'm joined today by two friends and colleagues that I work with frequently. First, to my far left, Andrea Wilson of BDO. And then in the middle here, Senator Mark Pryor, colleague and partner of mine here at Venable. And today, as indicated here, the focus is really to talk about the new Congress. I think we'd be remiss, though, to avoid talking about how things have kind of gotten started with the 116th Congress. As everyone in the room and everyone pretty much around the country is probably aware by now, shortly after, or right around the holidays, the government shut down for an unprecedented amount of time, 35 days, and only just reopened. That obviously has had a tremendous impact on the federal community, including not only the federal workers, obviously, but also the nonprofits, the contractors, those that work directly with, hand in glove, day to day with the federal government. It was only a partial shutdown, so the ramifications probably weren't as great as they could have been, but they were still significant. And, you know, talk to any contractor that does work with DHS or any other agency that was impacted, and it doesn't matter whether it was a partial or a full, it was hurtful and impactful. So I think we would kind of really be doing an injustice to everyone if we didn't start off talking a little bit about the shutdown. And what we saw and what some of our observations were with respect to the shutdown. Andre and I will definitely dive into some of our observations and some of our thoughts. But before we do, I'd love to have Senator Pryor give us some thoughts with respect to that. And if anyone needs dial-in or Wi-Fi information, we have that available as well. But I'd love to have Senator Pryor give us his initial thoughts and what do you think some of the broad impacts of the shutdown have been?
Yeah, thank you, Diz. I appreciate it very much. And welcome, everyone, and thank you for being at Venable and all those who are on the webinar. We appreciate you all as well. I guess I would say in a sort of a big picture, sort of step back from the shutdown for just a moment. I would say that, you know, as a recovering politician and a former senator, you know, it's frustrating to me because it was all totally avoidable. And right. We've seen a few shutdowns in recent years, and it's really a symptom of this dysfunction, this growing dysfunction that we see in Washington. And you know, if I remember the sequence of events here, the House and Senate were working on legislation to keep the government open. If I remember right, the Senate passed something, and then I guess, you know, folks went over to the White House and kind of talked him into making a stand on the wall, and y'all remember how that played out. And then, you know, next thing you know, it's shut down. And again, it's just completely avoidable. You know, one of the things, I know 2 years ago when you all talked about what you expect with a President Trump, I think one of the things that a lot of people thought, and I was one of these, that he had written this book, The Art of the Deal. And, you know, I was thinking as president, there's no bigger stage to make deals than right here. You know, I mean, this, you know, I really didn't know him and didn't know a lot about him. I never met President Trump. But I just felt like this is an opportunity to really shine. If someone really wants to get in and make deals and cut deals, there's no better place to do it. But in the last 2 years, he just has not shown any propensity or intention of doing that. And so, you know, I was not real happy, again, as a former senator, to see, you know, Congresswoman Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, come out in a press conference and then him have a press statement or a tweet. I mean, that's just not the way you negotiate, you know. So y'all know that. But in terms of, you know, a little more specific here, I'd say that clearly there are a lot of ramifications of this. I think that one of the things that bothers me the most about it is it really harms America's prestige. And you all feel it in your world in terms of the nonprofit world and things that you do. But, our allies feel it as well. And even the bad guys, people that we consider bad guys, they feel it. They see it, and they see it as an opportunity. And it's just hard to watch us do this and kind of repeat these type things. And, I just hope that things turn out better. But basically, the bottom line is what shutdowns and the dysfunction has created is a lot of uncertainty. And I'm sure that you all feel it in what you do every day. I know that at the law firm, certainly we see it a lot. We have a lot of clients in this law firm who are constantly asking us, what's going on? What do we do? How do we make a decision? Given the circumstances, what decision should we make? And it really does create uncertainty. So, we can talk a lot. I could talk a lot more about the politics and all that. By the way, let me just say one thing. I think one of the interesting things to keep an eye on over the next 3 weeks, because we may be here again, right, is Senator McConnell. Mitch McConnell was almost nowhere to be found during the shutdown. There's a lot of people talking about that. And the reason he was so quiet and so behind the scenes is because, again, we know this because we've been paying attention for the last couple of years. On a number of occasions, he's had an agreement with the White House. Even on this funding bill, he had an agreement with the White House that the Senate was going to pass a bill, House was going to pass it, blah, 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 the President was going to sign it. And the President just kind of tweeted and blew that whole thing up. And it's happened to Mitch a number of times where he's gone over there, or they've had conversations, or they've worked it out at staff level, whatever it happens to be, and then either someone will get a hold of the president's ear, or he'll start tweeting or whatever, and the whole thing just goes off the rails. And I think Mitch just was not going to stick his neck out on this one. And I just think he was like, okay, this is the Trump-Pelosi shutdown. This is not the McConnell shutdown. You guys fight it out, hash it out. And he was pretty smart, I think, to just lay back, let them duke it out. He sat there, and then when the time was right, and I think the time was right, by the way, again, not to get too much into politics, was last week when they had the 2 votes. And I think that, let's see if I remember right, the Republicans, their bill picked up 1 Democratic vote, but the Democratic bill picked up 6 Republican votes. And I think that what Mitch knew is that he was about to lose his caucus on this, that they were about to just go over the edge because there was no real political good way out other than just reopen the government, So anyway, it worked out the way it worked out, but it does create uncertainty, and I know that creates a lot of stress and strain on you guys.
Absolutely.
Further to the point about that you brought up Senator McConnell, I was going to ask you about it anyway, so thanks for bringing that up. Did he miss the 8th grade civics class where it said Congress can override a presidential veto on the one hand, and on the other hand, he's really a clever politician, and you'll of course remember the 2013 shutdown where he and Biden negotiated that too cute to be true, vote no, pass the budget trick that was out of nowhere. Got the government open because he knew so he knows how to do these kinds of things. Who would have thought of that little clever move that he did?
No, I agree, and your point is very good. And if anyone couldn't hear that on the webinar, he asked about McConnell, and we know that Senator McConnell, he's the majority leader of the Senate, and he's been around the Senate for a long, long time. He's very cagey, very good politician, knows how to, knows the ropes over there. It wasn't too long ago that he engineered reopening the government, and he did it with then Vice President Biden and did a nice little, as you said, a too cute to be true sort of maneuver and got it open, and it happened. I think he could have done that this time, except the factor that he had no control over was the president. And I think he was not going to try to execute anything unless the president, if you notice, by the way, when they finally struck the deal on the day, whatever it was, last Thursday, I don't remember which day it was, the president announced it. It wasn't McConnell, or it wasn't even Pelosi, it was the president. And I think that basically he was like, I'm not announcing this, because he's announced a lot of things in the last couple of years that have not happened because the president changed his mind. So I think he really probably wanted the president to own it.
And real quick, we welcome questions throughout the presentation. We're not going to run through a bunch of slides. It's going to be more of a discussion format. So please feel free to ask questions. If you're online, please feel free to send questions in, and we'll address as we go. We just ask that the folks in the room use one of the mics on either side of the room so people on the phone can listen. Andre, I'd like to get your view from kind of the ground in terms of what the impacts, or what have you seen, what have you heard from your clients about the impacts of the shutdown?
Yes, thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I think that obviously things just stood still. I had a number of clients, basically all of them that I could reach out to, that weren't being paid. So the payment offices were shut down. Audit resolutions were on pause. Even within OIG, I had a client that's going through a disclosure event right now. There was only one person within OIG to pick up the phone. And so you have all of these things that are happening real time in programs, and there was really nothing that could be done. And so you're losing precious time. I had one client that was promised incremental funding prior to the shutdown. It wasn't executed, and so they were in a position of furloughing staff. So the ramifications were pretty broad. Those that had funding could continue as long as they could handle the cash reserves. Much like the federal workforce, they could continue eating as long as they had sufficient financial reserves. But yeah, that's what I saw. I don't know if your experience is different, Diz. Yeah,
I wouldn't say it's much different. I mean, I think what we're seeing is, the agency's work just came to a standstill. If you have a cooperative agreement with an agency, you need their input, you need their consultation. They're not there. They're not picking up the phone. Applications for grants, obviously grant applications are, agencies take them on a rolling basis for different programs, and those, again, to a standstill. A lot of programs are predicated on dates, right? Those dates come and go, and it's a shutdown. What do you do? And I think while everyone saw it coming, the planning for it was just not there. I think maybe because the holidays, maybe because people thought at the end of the day that the president did say that he had a deal, and then went back on that deal, and then it was, that was right at the end. So the planning probably wasn't quite what it could or should have been. So I think it left a lot of nonprofits and contractors in a little bit of a pinch on what to do. And I also think the fact that it happened over the holidays, people kind of forgot about it, right? It took effect on the 26th, but most people were on vacation or, out for the holiday. And so it really didn't take effect until after New Year, when people started saying, oh, wait, no one's answering my phone. Like, I just thought it was quiet for the week. No, it was that the government was actually shut down. And so I felt like it also took a little while to gain steam in the contracting community and in the grant community. But certainly, the 35 days is much longer than what we've experienced, about twice as long as the last one, which was about 17 days. Or I guess the last substantial one, there was one that was a couple hours. But the 17-day one, and when you're talking about 35 days, I mean, that's a sizable chunk of the year that's lost, right? January is pretty much a lost month for many folks. And I think while we're open now, we've got about 2.5 weeks to maybe try to get our ducks in a row, get reorganized from what happened, but also take the opportunity now to prepare. And I think one of the things that I wanted to talk about and get and solicit your all's thoughts on is also what's the longer term impacts of the shutdown. And Senator, you kind of touched on that a little bit about how it really diminishes our reputation both nationally but internationally. Right. But I also think there's a deeper effect, especially since it impacted the workers so much and their pocketbook so much, is that are we going to maybe even see a greater turnover than what we've seen in the past with federal workforce, right? There's already been a problem with the federal workforce. It's undertrained, there's not enough. are we going to see workers start to migrate, if the job market is good, to migrate out of the government? And what does that mean for the government, right? A brain drain, a loss of human capital. And I'd love to get both of your perspectives on maybe some of the longer term impacts of the shutdown.
Well, I don't think there's any doubt that you'll see the brain drain. I mean, it's a very good observation because, you know, it used to be that a government job was, it may be a little bit slow sometimes, but it was steady. And with these disruptions coming and going, it takes the steadiness out of it. And a lot of people, they'd rather go private sector or they'd rather do something else other than work for the federal government. They may go to state government, may go to university, who knows what they're going to do. But, you know, they can't jeopardize their family situation and all that. And, you know, this was a really great hardship on a lot of Americans. And there's some numbers that were coming out in the last couple of days about how much it impacted the U.S. economy. And I think that, I'm sure that's true, it's probably impacted it more than what those numbers said. Those were initial reports. So, yeah, I think it's going to have a sort of a chilling effect, in effect, on hiring. And what you don't want to see is you don't want to see it degrade the federal workforce. You don't want it to see to lower the quality of the people applying for these jobs and all that. But I think some of that's going to be inevitable unless they get their stuff straightened out over there.
No, I would agree with that. I think you saw even the folks that were essential, that are very mission-focused, mission-first people. The first couple of weeks, that was still that mission focus, and then suddenly, as the days wore on, even in those agencies, your special agents, your investigators, your sort of law enforcement, we're all feeling it dramatically. Because can you imagine the stress of not being able to pay your mortgage and still having to go to work? So there was a lot, I think a very interesting point, even within the federal workforce, of just not being able to sustain those jobs any longer. I know we saw it personally. But I think in terms of the grant community, I think it was sort of a light bulb moment, a lot of for my clients that had to think of their own financial reserves differently. If you're a nonprofit, believe it or not, banks are not standing up and trying to give you a line of credit. And the ones that can get the lines of credit pretty easily, frankly, don't need them, right? Because they have large endowments or substantial reserves. So there's a bit of an irony there. So I think from a lot of my clients, they've sort of said, hey, we need to look at our entire reserve policy a little bit differently. And how long can we go without receiving our reimbursements from the federal government? So I did see that. I saw organizations being able to strategize about their fundraising efforts and how do we get more unrestricted funds in so that we can sustain these kinds of things. How are they looking at their board policies for board designations? So in some ways, I think the silver lining, I tend to be a silver lining kind of person. I saw a lot of fiscal discipline coming out of it, even from the organizations that are supported by the federal government.
That's good.
I think that's a great point. One of the things that we've touched on is that, in 2.5 weeks, we're at another inflection point for the U.S. government. I think everyone in the room probably could raise their hand that we hope that, something is done in that time frame that would avert a government shutdown. But I think we'd also be naive to not prepare, right? And so some of the thoughts, I'd love to hear the panelists' thoughts on what we should be doing to prepare, because maybe we didn't prepare well enough the first time. And candidly, there's nothing to say that if we get into another shutdown and it's over the wall and Pelosi holds her line, that this shutdown could go another 35 days. I mean, I don't want to be doom and gloom. I'd like to keep the silver lining. But I think you need to prepare as a lawyer, be prepared for the worst and hope for the best. My initial thinking is the government's, they've been a couple days back at work. This morning I was on the phone asking questions of someone who had been out and they'd been furloughed, and I got an earful from them about trying to get my issue front and center when they've got a backlog of, how many are emails and things. But at the end of the day, I would advocate that all my clients do that. You've got funding things that have been on hold. Get that stuff through, and because who knows what's going to happen in 2.5 weeks, and who knows how long that's going to go. So I think taking a hard look at where you're at with your finances and things, what monies are eligible to be drawn down to get payment on, reimbursement on, and try to drive that with the government. It's going to be difficult because they've got a lot of people probably in their ear, but the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So I'd love to hear both of your thoughts on maybe preparing in the event there should be another shutdown.
Yeah, I think that, all those incremental funding requests need to go in immediately. If you have any funds that can be obligated under your current awards, and utilizing both the agreement officer and your technical officer to do that. Typically, most agencies don't jump in the agreement officer until the technical folks tell them to. So pushing and pushing and pushing and making it about the program. Most people do not want to make it about overhead staff. So and your ability to make payroll, they frankly don't care. But if you talk about how it's going to impact your programs, the agencies will generally jump. So I think it's that. I think if you have funding, most letter of credits take about 2 days to process or even next day. So think about that, plan ahead. How much money can you draw down in advance on all of your current funding that you do have, and seeing how long that will last you. Worry about the math on the back end because we want to make sure that organizations don't have cash flow problems fundamentally, because you may not get paid for, as we saw in this case.
Let me just say that from my perspective, my guess is that there will not be another shutdown, that they'll find a way to work it out. I'm going to say that because that's the way it ought to be, and I really think that's probably the way it works out. But here's what you have to bear in mind, is that this first, you have these elements in the House and Senate right now. Let's take the House first. The so-called Freedom Caucus in the House, went to President Trump and, kind of gave him the rah-rah speech about how we have to stand by this wall promise, and kind of talked him into that and had him change his position on where he was. The Freedom Caucus has already sort of basically run 2 speakers out of town, right? You had Speaker Boehner, who probably in a different time would have gone down as a very, very good speaker, I'm guessing, because Boehner could make a deal, he could work with Democrats, he could do this. Same thing with Ryan, actually. Ryan was a little more wonkish than Boehner. Boehner was more the kind of the old school politician. Ryan was more sort of policy driven. But still, regardless, I think Ryan very much was an adult and wanted to make a deal and knew he had a job to do as Speaker of the House, historic position. He needed to do his job, but it was increasingly difficult to function there with the Freedom Caucus. He's getting it really from his right. Both of them had great opportunities to reach out to the other side of the aisle and work many, many different deals on legislation, not just funding, but all kinds of different things. But if they did that, if they cut out some of their own caucus and reached across the aisle to get some Democrats to do something, the backlash on them would have been horrendous. And that's unfortunate, but that's just the world we live in today, the political world we live in. And that's one thing right there we have to break. We can't punish our members of Congress, House and Senate, Democrats, Republicans, for doing their job, right? We can't do that. But that right now they do get punished if they try to work with the other side. So on the Senate side, I'd say that basically the way the Democrats are looking at this right now is they're not going to give the president one dime for this wall. They're not going to give him one dime. And the reason they're not is because he has made such an enormous political issue out of this wall, and they're just not going to give it to him. So I don't know how it works out. I think probably the solution, they'd already passed, I think in the Senate, they'd already passed $1.5 billion, if I remember the number, $1.3 billion, $1.5 billion for border security. And there's a lot of things in border security that will make this country safer that have nothing to do with the wall. And I think they should focus on that. I think that they could also add something that's desperately needed, which is Coast Guard funding. No one's really talked about that, but they had a hearing over there last year about the Coast Guard. If you gave them $1 billion, they could put it to immediate use right now. Put $1 billion in there for the Coast Guard. You know, whatever it happens to be. Sweeten the deal in whatever way you can. Let the president talk about border security. But I just don't think they're going to give him any money for the wall. Now, I may be wrong. But just in listening to people in the last couple of weeks, I just think that this is their first chance to really take him to the cleaners politically. They're just not going to let him have it. So I think the White House is going to have to settle for something they don't want to settle for, but I do think they will try to reopen the government, not have another shutdown like we've had. That's my guess.
Well, we'll cross our fingers. We do have a couple questions coming in online about kind of the shutdown or better preparing an organization. So with regard to organizational manpower, thoughts on how management can be more innovative to redeploy staff and use them, take especially the most vulnerable members of their team. So, Andrea, your thoughts on kind of what to do with your staff if you are at a little bit of an impasse in terms of funding on certain programs?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very case-by-case specific because it's going to be a matter of where you are on individual programs and your available funding, right, your incremental funding that you have, essentially, in which you're spending into. The government, and I kind of always say, too, we have to look at it from not just today, but also what are audit historians going to see. And I think that they will question some costs if all of a sudden you start throwing bodies into a program that has money when you were, perhaps redeploying them from a program that, was about out of money. So I would never sort of suggest that you should just go throw bodies into a program that just because it has money. I don't think you'll end up having a good outcome when you get audited. Sorry to put on my auditor hat.
No, I think it's a good point.
That's what you're here for.
I would add, a lot of times nonprofit organizations have a very long to-do list, right? That never seems to get addressed because there's just no time to get to it. That's an opportunity. I'll put on my compliance hat, which is compliance typically falls by the wayside when operations are humming. No time like the now to work on getting your compliance program in better shape. Those expenses can go into an indirect bucket. Maybe if there's a steep increase in indirect rates, that'll be problematic. So you've got to keep that in mind to some regard. But, doing things that the organization needs done. I actually was speaking to a client last week, and we had the good fortune of just having a legal hold notice lifted because an investigation had resolved itself just before the shutdown. And so they were redeploying their staff to getting rid of all the stuff that was being accumulated because of legal hold notice. Just tons of things they were just going to go through and have these people do while they were sitting, without anything else to do. Maybe it's not exactly what you have in mind for, the use of your staff, but candidly, it's better than furloughing them in their perspective. And it's better than, the carrying costs of whatever it is that you're doing that's not being addressed. So, dusting off that list of things that would be nice to have done when you have time. When your programs are shut down, try to redeploy your resources internally to improve your organization. I think that's something to think about. Yes. Can you use the microphone? Thank you.
So with regard to staffing, and actually we run a Department of Energy National Laboratory. This time we're funded, so that's not an issue. But in the 2013 shutdown, and DOE has 2-year appropriations, but we were still running out of funding. We had I think at the time, about a dozen or so H-1B folks on staff. And it turns out we had at the time a library that was on non-federal property, and we have some non-federal operational funds. And so we were thinking about sending the folks over to cubicles there and I don't know, whatever you can do, write reports or whatever to cover the H-1B so they wouldn't have to be deported. Some of the other labs, like Stanford, they had like 100 H-1Bs, I believe, and so you can't send 100 people to the library to write reports. And other visas have, different sort of criteria. So can you talk about protecting that group of specialized folks, visa people in the lapse of funding?
I will give it to you.
Okay.
That sounds like a legal question.
I am going to go back to Andrew's statement, though. It's a case-by-case basis. I mean, so you have literally hundreds of people that are on a work visa. It's going to be a challenge, right? Because they have to be employed, they have to be working in order to maintain that visa. You're just going to have to examine all the programs and whether or not certain programs can take on additional staff without raising some of the audit concerns. Right. So it's a tough situation. It might be something worth trying to talk through with the agency in advance. Should there be another shutdown? How can we handle this? Because this goes directly to the concern that we all talked about, the brain drain, right? If the government continues to do this, people are going to not only leave government service, but even leave government support service, right? Leave the nonprofit community that services the federal government and leave the contracting community that services the federal government and just go commercial because it's not worth the headache of hiring good staff and then just watching them go because you can't have stable funding. I mean, it's ridiculous, in fact. Yes.
Hi, I'm John Lazar with the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and I'd like to get back to the discussion around possibly another shutdown, or at least the uncertainty of future shutdowns, and the impact you just brought up about a diminished workforce in federal agencies, which would also have a detrimental impact on nonprofits. Do you see any intensification of pressure on foundations to become more responsive, to fill in during these type of instances? In the Chronicle of Philanthropy this month, there's a mixed article about really how much foundations actually give back from their endowment. And I'm wondering if this will usher in a new era where maybe foundations are going to have to think differently and be more responsive in the amount of the endowment that they give. I'd be interested in any of your discussions on that.
Yeah, so I do work with a number of foundations, and I think that foundations are, and I actually work with a number of large foundations that are kind of coming together on a lot of thought leadership around the true costs and indirect cost recovery and all of that. And I think this is sort of an interesting sort of slant on that kind of conversation and in how much it's sort of the conversation of pay what it takes, right, for those programs. I think that the majority of foundations, at least the ones that I work with, really do see a distinction between and I'm sorry if any of you are listening, distinction between program support and what they call core support. They do, and it's much like a program that a federal agency would support or sponsor, and it's very stark on how they really view those two. And it doesn't mean that you can't be in both buckets as a recipient or a grantee. But with their sort of sponsored programming, they really care solely about the impact of those investments, and they consider them investments, right? Versus an organization that they're going to provide core funding to, they see that organization as an investment. So if you talk to any foundation, they talk solely in terms of investment, right? And now we're seeing growingly this public-private partnership between foundations and the federal government, right? I work with a number of large foundations that, the USAID, for example, is providing 50% and the foundation is providing 50%. I think that's where we'll see the change first. right? What happens to that program if the government is shut down and XYZ Foundation is supporting it? I think that's going to give the foundations a really big food for thought in that. I know the Chronicle of Philanthropy very well, and they've been big advocates for pay what it takes, and where is that investment strategy? Are foundations hoarding too much of their cash? Are they just breaking the minimum of their required spend, so on and so forth? I think that it's a little bit too big of an issue to brush over with. You have to look by foundation, because they all have a very specific sort of perspective. I probably didn't answer your question.
Well, I can add a little bit to it, and Senator, this may have something for you to contribute on as well when we get into this, because I think when the Trump administration took office, I think there were a number of private foundations that viewed the administration's viewpoints as antithetical to their perspective. And those foundations, I think a lot of them saw a tremendous uptick in funding and saw themselves as kind of ambassadors to pushing that agenda forward that was not going to be supported by the federal government. Mostly I'm thinking in reproductive rights. And so, or at least that's an example. So there's a number of foundations that I think have kind of taken the mantle, so to speak, to say, we don't need the federal government to kind of push this issue forward in Africa or in other countries. We're going to do it ourselves, and they'll pick a couple organizations to kind of steward that. So I think this shutdown will, I think, only embolden certain large foundations to do the same. So the heck with the federal government. They're not reliable. They can't get anything done. We're just going to do it ourselves. And I think that's how shutdowns continue and the gridlock continues in Congress.
I don't have a whole lot to add other than, that it's a great question, because I think that, as these two have said, it just depends on the circumstances and which foundations we're talking about. But I do think some will probably try to step in there and fill the void, and a lot of them just won't be able to. But, really, if you think about it, people always talk about how inefficient the federal government is and all that. But the truth is, in terms of the efficiency of providing services to the most people, it's fairly efficient, actually. In fact, we did a study when I was in the Senate about Medicare and Medicare funding, and of course, the insurance companies were poking at Medicare and saying, we could provide these services a lot cheaper, so they wanted, these supplemental policies for Medicare, which they had gotten years ago. But we were looking at those, and they were charging more. They were less efficient than the Medicare system, is bottom line. And you're like, wait a minute, that's not supposed to be private sector. But the profit motive there is real. And so anyway, I think you'll see some foundations step in the void, but it really just depends on who it is.
We have a couple more questions kind of related to the shutdown, and then we'll kind of move to a more general discussion on the new Congress. But one of the questions that I thought might be of interest to a great many of you is...
You have an online question there, you mean?
Yes, sorry. Yeah. Thoughts on how the board of directors should be involved when an organization's maneuvering during a political crisis or potential crisis moment. Andre, do you have any thoughts on how a board of directors should be involved in some of these decisions?
Sure. And once again, it depends on essentially your situation, but I think that the spending rule is one that comes immediately to mind, and the board designations within their spending rule are really important. What flexibility does the board give to management to sort of address immediate cash flow needs that may be sort of brought upon them without any fault of their own? So board engagement is really important. I also think that, you never lose an opportunity to sort of promote your mission. And I think in these situations, it's also important for the board to understand the organization's responsibility to communicate out to the public about what is the impact of losing these programs. And I think that the board needs to sort of understand that as well, because they are champions of these organizations. I've even seen situations where board giving was increased, because for nonprofits use the board as a fundraising arm, but that's obviously a slow process to increase your fundraising. Like I said before, I've seen my organizations that I work with really seen this as an impetus to really increase their unrestricted, because they needed that fungibility.
And then one other question before we move on. One way maybe to handle it is temporary pay cuts for the executive team in order to keep staff on the payroll. Have you seen any organizations go down that road? There's obviously maybe some employment law issues or contract issues related to that, but any thoughts on that?
I frankly didn't see that this time around within my clients, but I maybe didn't ask the question that way. I've seen that occur in clients that are going through like suspension and debarment issues, which are much more dramatic. But I've definitely seen it in those circumstances. I didn't see it in this one because I think one of the reasons why organizations weren't willing to take those very drastic cuts is because there was no end in sight. Like you didn't know if it was going to be over tomorrow and then all of this for naught, or was it going to go on for 2 more months, right?
Right. No, it's a good point. And also I think it's something obviously to talk with Employment Council about, but I think there's some precedent issues that you need to consider, as well as many of you probably know, many federal programs cap executive comp, and if you're cutting executive comp at certain crisis moments, might it be a door to an auditor to say, well, why is your executive comp so high? If they can survive at a crisis moment with less comp, then why have it so high all the time? Does it create that problem? So certainly something to think about, and obviously I'm sure the workforce would appreciate it. But again, if you are cutting executive comp, are you those executives, if they're not doing it at their free will, are they then more inclined to move on to a different space? Again, brings up that whole brain drain concern. You want these nonprofits to be staffed with the best people you can find. This is why a lot of organizations don't worry about the cap on executive comp. They want the best people running these organizations. And if you start taking a whack at their compensation, they may find greener pastures elsewhere. Okay, we've spent about half the time on the shutdown, but I'd like to also, when we first put this program together, believe it or not, it was pre-shutdown. So we do want to talk about the 116th Congress. 2 years ago, when the Trump administration was ushered in, we had a unified, I'll put that in quotes, unified government, right? Both houses and the administration were all in the same party. I don't think nearly as much got done as people thought might get done, regardless of whether you thought it was good or bad. But now we have a little bit more divided government. I'd like for Senator Pryor to kick us off here with his thoughts about the kind of the overlay of the Pelosi-run House with the McConnell Senate and then obviously the Trump administration.
Yeah, thanks, Diz. I would say that, let me pick up on something Diz said like 30 minutes ago, which is he talked about how the shutdown came at an odd time. And it was odd because it was Christmas and New Year's and all that end of the year stuff and the beginning of the year stuff. But it also was odd because we had a new Congress coming in. So we had gone through this election where, and I've forgotten the exact numbers, 30 some odd Republicans had lost their seats in the House. Y'all correct me on the number, I don't remember exactly. And honestly, a lot of them weren't real excited, weren't real gung-ho about coming back to Washington to try to solve this. I mean, they'd kind of, been through the ringer already, and they didn't really want to come back up here and vote on a wall or whatever it was going to be. So they sort of limped out of town, I guess you can say. And you all know that there were days and days where they really didn't meet, or it was just pro forma session. And so they probably did miss some days there where they maybe could have worked together, but you had this new Congress coming in, so no one just really had the political will to do it. So now the new Congress is here. And I would say that in terms of just politics, again, kind of big picture here, and a lot of people have said this, it's not news really, but just for you all to keep in mind, this GOP is, I'm going to use the term that's not a real word, but Trumpier, right? This is Trumpier than the other, previous iterations of the Republican Party. And you have a lot of people whose elections turned on Donald Trump, one way or the other. They either got elected because they're against Donald Trump, or they got reelected maybe because they're for Donald Trump. And so the GOP is definitely, again, more Trumpier. The Democratic Party is more liberal. And unfortunately for the rest of us, that middle continues to erode and get smaller. And there's just not that group of congressmen and senators like there used to be that could be in the middle and could work with both sides and didn't have these hardcore constituencies that they could get in and find that blended solution that really is what works best in our system of government. So if you think about like the senators who left on the Democratic side, you had Bill Nelson, Heidi Heitkamp, Claire McCaskill, and Joe Donnelly. They all lost their elections, and none of those were flaming liberals. They were, kind of sort of moderate, at least on some issues they were. All of them were on some issues. And then the people who replaced them are more conservative. So what you see is, again, the continued polarization in the Senate. Same thing would, I'd say, for the Republican senators who left. And most of these senators left on their own. They didn't get beat, but, Orrin Hatch left, and he was a pretty conservative guy. But Dean Heller, John McCain, of course, passed away. Bob Corker, a couple others. They really weren't these flame-throwing conservative firebrands, So, again, a lot of the people who came in, depending on Democrat or Republican, but I think it's fair to say that it's more polarized. That's not good news for you all. It's just not. It's not the way, the government should work. It's not a good way to run a railroad, but that's just kind of where we are right now. So the one thing I would say keep in mind is that you're going to hear a lot of noise coming out of the House Democrats. And I'm a Democrat. I love them, but they're going to make a lot of noise. And at the end of the day, they can't get a whole lot done without the Senate and the president, right? Now, one thing they can do is they can do investigations, and they will do investigations. And they've been talking about this very openly. In fact, our investigations practice here at Venable is, I got a call today on something where one of our clients is being asked to go over there. But I pulled something out of National Journal, and this is a month or two old, but this lists 3 major categories of investigations. One's core oversight, one's corruption and good government, and the third is waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, there's a total of, almost 20 boxes on this sheet. And investigating President Trump, Russia, all that, it's really doesn't even really have its own box in here because it's kind of spread out through a lot of these boxes. But I think that definitely the House will do investigations where they lead. I'm not sure. I really don't think right now I don't think anyone is seriously talking about impeachment. But one of the reasons they want to do investigations, from my standpoint, is the Congress should hold people accountable. And that they shouldn't do it for political reasons. They should do it for good government reasons. There's a lot of good government investigations and just oversight that has not really been done in the last few years. And there's different reasons for that. So there's kind of a pent-up demand generally. But then you take the last 2 years, like everything from FBI Director Comey's firing to just all kinds of things related to this administration, you're going to see lots and lots of investigations on that. And I guess the other thing I would say is we've seen President Trump operate for the last 2 years in an environment where he did have the House and the Senate. And I think Diz is right. They actually didn't get as much passed as you might think that they would have. I think the expectations, let me tell you what happened here at Venable when in November when Donald Trump won, okay? So the day before the election, we were all convinced that Hillary Clinton was going to be the next president, right? And probably everybody in this room was. We were all convinced of that, whether everybody on the, in the firm wanted it that way or not, but they were just convinced that's what was going to happen. That was conventional wisdom. Election day happens. Guess what? Biggest upset maybe in American history. Some might say with an assist from the Russians. We don't know that yet. We'll see what.
You don't need to look at me.
We'll just see what Mueller investigation turns up on that. I think everybody's wanting to know kind of what really happened. But anyway, regardless of that, then the day after, and this is true, and this maybe happened in your offices as well, but we walked in, and it was like stunned silence. I mean, nobody knew what to do. It was like everybody was in a funk, a haze. They had no idea. Well, then, so that was Wednesday. Thursday after the election, our phone starts ringing off the hook, and it's our clients calling. Hey, we've got a new president coming in. Hey, he wants to deregulate. Hey, he wants to cut taxes. Hey, he wants to do this. He wants to do that. Well, of course, 90% of the things that they thought they wanted or he was going to do for them, he's not been able to get done. But on the dereg stuff, he's done a lot of that, or he's tried to do a lot of that. Of course, they had the big tax cut. We know that. And there's been a few other successes. I'm not trying to minimize it. But it really, like Diz said, I think after the stun was over and we all kind of came back to reality and the fog cleared a little bit, we thought, hey, they're going to rock and roll on this and they're going to get a ton of stuff done. You got a House, Senate, and the White House. It's teed up to go, but it really hasn't been. I mean, the Supreme Court, thanks to Mitch McConnell, you got 2 justices there, and you have the tax cut. Again, I'd say largely thanks to McConnell and the Congress, the Republicans in the Congress. Not really administration wins, really. So
yeah, I mean, infrastructure was a big thing, immigration obviously a big thing, and those are still hung up. Question?
I had a question about the investigations. So, Senator, do you foresee that the investigations that the House Democrats will hold in this next Congress to be reasonable, whatever that means, sort of in the Burr-Warner kind of context, or do you think they'll be, at least in my opinion, unreasonable like the Nunes-Gowdy kind of investigations, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, definitely I do know what you mean. I think that there will be definitely some unreasonable investigations. And even if the point of that particular investigation is fairly reasonable and it's good government, it's good oversight that you really ought to do in any given year, the temptation is just going to be so great to, for example, for the House Democrats to go after the Trump administration. And of course, a lot of this is personal. Like, for example, if you take an issue that should be totally out of politics is, with the journalist who was killed supposedly by the Saudis, right? It's a terrible situation. American citizen, terrible situation. There should be hearings on it. Normally, definitely would be hearings on it, and there will be. But with this one, you have this Donald Trump element to it. You have things like his business interests, his family's involvement with certain players in different places, and all this. Not to get into all that, but there are just going to be some congressmen that just can't resist going there. Yeah, so that's what I think. So I think some of this will be pretty sensational. I'm not sure again, it's going to be a lot of noise. I'm not sure it really results in a lot, but I think you'll see a lot of hearings that just go on. And let me say this. I don't know if y'all ever read the website 538, but there was a story in there recently about as the hearings go on, there's no doubt statistically, as the hearings go on, the president's approval ratings drop. And again, not to be cynical, but there will be people that will want these to go on and just to continue in that drip, 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 just to erode his popularity. Because if his popularity goes, then the Democrats win the White House and probably keep the House, probably win the Senate. So there's all that politics that you just really can't escape. I'm not saying that's the way it ought to be, but that's just the way it is.
Pelosi control her caucus is the way she's tamped down the impeachment discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question. He asked if Speaker Pelosi can control her caucus. I think that generally she's done a great job so far. By the way, we have Bart Stupak in our office, and former congressman of Michigan. And Bart was telling us the other day, he said, she's done a remarkably better job this time as Speaker than she did last time. And I think that's just experience and kind of being in the minority again and lessons learned and all that. She has done a good job of controlling her caucus, but I'll say this, it's hard to do because you have 435 House members and 200 and I've forgotten the number, 240, I've forgotten the number this year, are Democrats. And it's going to be hard on every single hearing to keep them, sort of out of the danger zone, between the rails every single time. So I think there's going to be issues. She's going to try hard. Then on the Senate side, of course, how many, 10 senators are running for president or something like this? I mean, you got all that agenda going over there too. So, we'll just have to see how they do.
Senator, I actually have a question on the hearings. Because in years past, there's some things that have happened in the last couple of years that I would think the Congress would be extremely interested and concerned about as they affect the nonprofit community. For instance, the Teen Partnership Pregnancy Program was a program that was a bipartisan program, had a lot of scientific backing in terms of the types of programs that they disseminated to youth to prevent pregnancy. Trump administration took over, changes at HHS, abstinence first policy has taken root. The organizations that are the grant recipients are largely, have a viewpoint of many other types of approaches to preventing teen pregnancy. The Trump administration tried to terminate all those grants, and there's been a number of lawsuits that have stemmed from that has kind of rebuffed the Trump administration, but essentially it was a rebuke to the congressional mandate about what to do with this money. I would think that that's a good topic for hearings. However, my guess, is at the beginning of this Congress at least will likely be much more high-profile,
right, politically
motivated type of hearings, and some of these, what I think are pretty important issues, probably we're going to get short shrift in terms of hearings.
Yeah, I think that's right. So again, just a little context here. If you look back at the Congress and the White House over the last, let's just say 25 years. I'll pick a number. So let's say you have President Clinton in office, right? Well, then when the new administration came in, the President George W. Bush, when he came in, they tried to sort of undo everything Clinton did. So in other words, they thought Clinton was too left, so they veered things over to the right, right? And guess what? Lots of lawsuits, lots of problems, lots of things get tied up in court. Regulations can't get done because it's gummed up in the process because of different reasons. They violate certain provisions, et cetera, whatever it is, statutes, whatever it is. Well, then, guess what? Obama comes in. So what does Obama do? He wants to undo everything that the Bush administration done. So here we are veering back to the left. And now we have President Trump, exactly what he does. He veers back to the right. That's not helpful, okay? We talked about sort of predictability and stability and things like that before. That wide variation is just not helpful. And those things will be challenged. They probably should be challenged, regardless of where you fall on some of those issues, some of those social issues. But some of them are just pretty, just issues that I think most Americans would agree with. You shouldn't break all the rules to try to get the results you want. And that's another thing about this administration. Again, they've really had very few legislative successes, a few, but again, that's mostly been nominations. Very few legislative accomplishments. So if the administration was smart, they would really handle things differently. But I think when they came in, I think that there were lots of inexperienced people in the Trump White House and Trump administration, lots and lots of inexperienced people. And a lot of those have been weeded out. The other problem that President Trump had, for whatever reason, and this goes back to Diz's point about not getting nearly as much done, is they still, 2 years in, have several vacancies around the government. And it's just, it's not bizarre, but it's unfortunate for them. If they really want to get their agenda done, they need to fill out their organizational chart and put the right people in the right places to do that. but there's still a ton of vacancies, ton of acting and temporary people, and folks have retired. They've elevated people up. And we had a deal the other day where I asked a friend of mine, I said, well, who is the decision maker on this? And he's like, I have no idea, because the person in there is acting and the person under them is acting. And I don't know, how we make a decision. So all that just goes back to what you guys have said a few moments ago. It's not helpful. It's certainly not helpful to you go out. It creates, it just creates uncertainty, and it creates this sense of topsy-turviness that things could change or turn on you very quickly. And, it's just not the way it's supposed to be, not as stable as it's supposed to be.
One of the areas that I think has been, to your point, Senator, about kind of the government or the Trump administration not really putting enough people in the right spots is OMB. So Mick Mulvaney has about, 17 different hats within the federal government right now.
Never seen anybody like it.
It's hard to imagine how OMB can get anything done. Well, in fact, OMB doesn't get a lot done these days, except deregulating. But one of the big issues Andre and I have been involved in over the past couple of years is uniform guidance. And there has been talk of amending it to address some of the issues now that it's a few years in. And Andre, I guess, are you hearing anything, or what are your thoughts whether, we'll see any movement in the next couple of years, regulatory or practically speaking, about the grant community and how grants are done, and maybe some of the audit results that are coming out now might help influence that? I don't know, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, the short answer is I think we'll hear crickets, right? I don't think that's going to be high on the list of deregulating grants. I don't think that we have a very pro-business administration, and so their priorities are deregulating the business sector, the financial sector, so on and so forth. I don't think they think of the nonprofit sector as a sector, very frankly. But that said, I think we're also in some ways a little too early in to really know the complete impact of the UG. And the reason why is because a lot of those audits are just making their way into the clearinghouse. And it takes some time to get good trends, right? So I do a lot of statistics and a lot of data analytics, and so we like data-driven solutions, right? And I don't think we're there yet. We have too many one-offs that I personally would say, oh, that would be good policy.
Right.
But very frankly, we're not seeing things being done, as Senator Pryor said, through policy. You probably know the numbers, but the number of executive orders over recent administrations, not just the Trump administration, but if you look at Bush Jr., not H.W., W. Bush versus Obama versus Trump, I mean, the number of executive orders just keeps skyrocketing. So we're not doing things through a legislative process.
Yeah, and the frustrating thing there is that, not to be too partisan, but the Republicans ridiculed Obama for doing, government by executive order, and President Trump's done even more than he did. He's exceeded those numbers. So it's unfortunate.
But I personally think it's a symptom of the polarization of politics, right? You don't have centrists anymore, and so in clean bills, you don't have clean bills, so people can't vote for anything that has any compromise in it. But once again, I'm an accountant.
Question came in online, and I'd love both of your perspectives on it. It's a funding issue, and one that I think, let's assume Congress and the presidency move towards passing budgets on a timely basis to some degree. The question is, do we anticipate programs to be just outright cut? I don't think that's going to happen because of the shutdown, but certainly at some point a new budget's going to have to be passed for 2020. I would think that the House should have some input on that, not all the input. What are your perspectives on the divided Congress sending a budget to the president?
Okay, so let me just say thanks for that one, Diz. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
No, that's great. I'm happy to answer it. But for all of you people who are listening in your pajamas right now, It's 23 degrees and snowing downtown. So you probably made a good decision for not coming in. Listen, I think that with the budget, okay, the budget system generally has just been slowly grinding to a halt. It's too bad. In fact, last year, Ryan and McConnell, actually the big four, so to speak, they all got together, 4 leaders got together and had a process to try to figure out ways to fix the budget process. And one of my friends, a Republican congressman from Arkansas, he was the House chair of that, and he did a great job. They did great work, but at the end of the day, they didn't produce anything. But anyway, we ought to reform our budget process. But what's happening now is the trend is the president will send over a budget, and it doesn't matter which president, it doesn't matter which party, the Congress just ignores it. And the Congress starts on their own budget. And so, and what happens is the president's budget is full of messages. So, like, for example, let's say he wants to cut a certain program. He'll just zero it out. That's his sort of message he's sending. It's not real budgeting. And let me say the House and Senate are just as guilty. They have all these gotcha votes as they're going through the process, and that's not real budgeting. It's not helpful. But it's become just a huge mess. And, you know, Diz says, well, we'll have to have a budget in 2020. The truth is there's been a few years recently where we didn't have a budget. Right. And that's horrible. And again, that's bad government. So my guess is that you will definitely, almost every program that y'all are talking about, will see in somebody's budget an effort to cut the budget, if not eliminate the budget completely, because that's what they've been doing. I do some stuff. I'm on the Fulbright board over at the State Department, and last year, sure enough, the Trump administration's budget, I don't know if it zeroed out Fulbright, but it almost did. And, you know, that's a program that's 70 years old. I mean, there's no doubt it's been a very, very successful program, and it's just really cheap to do as well, considering all the budget. But nonetheless, I think that I guess I'd say don't get too worried about some of these initial budgets you see, but you need to pay very close attention to what the committees are doing in the Congress, because that's where the real action will be. And them trying to restore funding or making cuts or whatever. And you have to remember, we have a lot of budget pressure now because, as a recent example, we just passed a huge tax cut, and it's completely unpaid for. You would think that at some point there might be spending cuts to offset that, but, you know, when they did that, they increased the spending. So we'll just have to see what happens and see what the mood is and the appetite is. Yes, ma'am.
In light of your comments, I'm curious if you could suggest, or anyone, some creative strategies for nonprofits in terms of if funding is going to be cut. You know, would that look like partnering with different agencies or other foundations, ways to make sure that you are stable in, you know, your funding as a nonprofit?
Sure. I think that we've actually seen a lot of organizations sort of taking that up since the Trump administration, very frankly. And it's kind of been interesting. We've seen organizations say, well, I work in the environment, for example, so I need to sort of diversify. Well, ironically, all of my environmental NGOs have seen a boom in funding, because where the government shut off, all of their other contributions, either through foundations or private giving, have actually skyrocketed. And so they've actually seen a gang versus a bust, right? And so it's really interesting whenever you actually get into the details, because we say, most organizations will say, well, I need to diversify. If I'm only a U.S. aid sort of contractor or implementer, maybe I need to sort of do some more domestic programs because there's more stomach for domestic than for international. Ironically, what we're actually seeing is more organizations are doubling down into their core mission. And those organizations, very frankly, have been much more successful than ones that have been trying to sort of say, I'm a jack of all trades. I don't know if that will continue. I'm merely, you know, kind of talking about a trend that I've seen. I've seen more organizations be more specific because it's resonating more with their non-governmental donors, right? Why would Gates support somebody who does everything when they can find the best at X? right? And we're seeing that over and over be true. And those organizations I see skyrocketing. And ironically, then the government is coming to them. So I, have a lot of clients that are really great at this one thing, and because now all these foundations are supporting them, the government is coming in to buy into that success.
There's also a somewhat related question online about the international community, and again, I think this kind of feeds into some of the things we're talking about, which is, and to go back to one of the senator's comments at the outset, which is, kind of the lost prestige of the United States. Well, when the Trump administration took office, there was already a concern, and I think it's building, which is the U.S. government is kind of taking a step back on the international scene, and other countries are stepping into that void. And one of the questions is, to diversify funding, do we start looking at international, other countries, right? And their international dollars to help support your organization. Now, your organization may be domestic only, but should you start expanding outside? Andre, any perspective on expanding outside the U.S. to look at and court that international donor?
Yeah, that has actually been a significant trend as well. We're seeing more organizations that were somewhat more domestic in their focus branching out, because we do see a lot more of the big foundations are definitely supporting international activities, and so we do see that. But once again, it's still in their core program area, right? If they're a poverty alleviate organization, we see them doing that more internationally than before, public health, so on and so forth. I don't personally see a lot of them going into different program areas.
But sticking with the core, but looking for different funders for the core service.
Exactly.
Okay. A question, I don't know if either of you can answer this, but I think it's a good one, which is the nonprofit community. This emailer says the nonprofit community is the 5th largest industry globally. Any thoughts on how that community can coalesce to have its voice heard better than maybe it is currently? For-profit businesses have the Chamber of Commerce, right? Nonprofits have lots of different organizations, but any way that they can coalesce to make sure that the nonprofit voice is heard more loudly, or more folks are more attentive to it?
Well, it's a great question, and it is something that ought to happen. Of course, one reason that it's difficult is the nonprofit world is incredibly diverse, and they're not, they have totally different missions, and they just kind of cover the whole waterfront. But I would, from my standpoint, I think in terms of media and politics, and I think that there are definitely ways that nonprofits can get their message out better, more effectively, and not just using their websites, but doing different community events, trying to draw the right kind of attention to what you're doing or the needs in a community, whatever happens to be whatever your mission happens to be. So there's ways to do that. And then, of course, I'm always of the opinion that it's good to let your elected officials know. And I don't just mean the Congress, but I'm talking about mayors, governors, state, House, state, Senate, Congress, president, cabinet officials, et cetera. But let your government officials know, your elected officials and non-elected officials know what you're up to and what you're doing and the success you're having, and give them, find ways to partner with them if there's such a thing to do that. So I think that it would be great if we saw, the nonprofits be higher profile. I mean, honestly, it's nice, when you turn on PBS and they've sponsored, like the PBS NewsHour, but that doesn't move the needle much for the general public. It needs to be really more of a multifaceted, multimedia, multi-layered strategy.
One other specific question came through with respect to OMB. Andrea, I haven't heard anything, but there is a 5-year review of the UG that was required, which would have been happening last year if it was done. Have you heard anything about that 5-year review?
No, I've heard questions from industry groups that support maybe research or whatever subsector of the nonprofit community, but I frankly haven't seen much action from the OMB side.
Okay. Sure.
Since you keep bringing up the UG, So it, in its current form, was enacted December 26, 2014, so it's just a few years old, as you point out. But in fact, it had been policy at National Science Foundation for many, many, many years. National Science Foundation, about $7.5 billion, most of the money goes out as grants and cooperative agreements. They give very few contracts, actually, as you know. And so, and I used to be an attorney at NSF. I have some familiarity with their now regulation. So it has had a long time of field testing, if you will. So it's not really that brand new on the one hand. And on the other hand, my organization receives financial assistance agreements from other agencies, Department of Commerce or NASA, for example. And I have to tell you that the awards people at those agencies are not familiar with the nuances of the UG the way that everybody at NSF knows about it. Of course, it came from NSF, and you know NSF could implement even before the rulemaking was complete because it was already their policy. So I don't really know what. So my question is, what are the issues with the UG that people are? You know, you brought it up twice. So
yeah,
I'm just
well,
asking.
my perspective is this: is that the UG, while it may have started at NSF, NSF has a very discrete and focused mission and type of work. When you blow it out to the entire federal government, you're going to be dealing with a whole lot of other types of situations that maybe the UG wasn't particularly, designed for. And so ultimately, and when you put it to that kind of scrutiny, ultimately there's going to be vagaries, there's going to be ambiguity, there's going to be things that, need to be kind of sussed out in process. And I think to Andre's point, there's not enough audit results yet to really say, where that is. But I know from my own anecdotal working with clients that some things are just not clear. And some things are completely unworkable. And some things I just completely doubt the federal government's ability to truly implement or adhere to something. And so I would love to see what, the internal review of the UG and how it's being implemented by the agencies, because I agree that most of the agencies don't have a good facility even several years in.
Yeah. And we're not even seeing it from the auditor. Auditors have to be trained and have to have consistent implementation of how they're assessing. It took a while for the A133 or single audit supplement to be issued after the UG. And that's really the measure, right, is how are people doing in terms of their compliance. And that took a long time. So auditors aren't really up to date. I do a lot of training on the UG, and the inconsistencies within how organizations are implementing, but even how auditors are auditing it is really dramatic. And so when I say, I can tell you anecdotally that we're going to have a lot of findings this next year on procurement, because it's the first year that procurement is really in place for everybody, right? But then within that procurement, the threshold's increased. And so you still don't have a clean year because now we have this disparate treatment within organizations. Subrecipient monitoring. Now, we've had 2 years of really clean time periods with subrecipient monitoring, but I will tell you that is the one area within auditors I find the most inconsistency of what they will tolerate as good subrecipient monitoring, right? And those are the two biggest really changes. The mandatory disclosure language is, Diz is rolling his eyes, is really terribly written, right? Very frankly. So most of us go back to the FAR language because it's been time tested and it was better regulated and legislated. So I that's my personal opinion.
Yeah, some of the issues are it was designed to be flexible, but flexibility creates subjectivity. Auditors, accountants, lawyers, we like objective standards and criteria. And if the auditors are always going to be different people with different subjective views, then inevitably you're going to have this kind of inconsistency.
Yeah.
Question?
Just more of a recommendation. This talk about the brain drain reminded me of an article, an opinion piece by Congressman Bill Pascrell on January 11th, and the title of it is "Why is Congress So Dumb?" No offense. But it basically was talking about how way back under Newt Gingrich, he says basically provided a self-lobotomy for Congress because they got rid of 1 out of every 3 congressional researchers and staffers. And so there's this internal congressional brain drain where you don't have the oversight capability to ask intelligent questions at any of these hearings because there are so few staffers who know what to tell you to ask. And it was also went on to say, also no offense to Venable, but how basically all of our laws are getting written by lobbyists because there's no one no staffers to write the laws. They're just taking boilerplate legislation and then you're not even, the Congress aren't even seeing it. So I commend that article to everybody because it has a lot of great statistics about what, that is a real problem, and it goes back to, Newt. Anyway, thank you for having us here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Senator, any thoughts on that? Being that you're not an active member of Congress, no offense taken, right?
No offense taken. And of course, I love to criticize Newt Gingrich as well. No, I'm kidding about that. But no, I think, the Congress needs good expertise and needs the right number of people over there to do the research and some of it's institutional knowledge. But if you think about Congress, for example, you have Congress as an institution versus like OMB. And there's some real battles, and they don't always make the papers, but there's some real battles about trying to sort out some differences that OMB sees, et cetera, et cetera. So you need the right people there to do it. My guess is, and I don't know, I'd have to look at Pascrell's article, but my guess is that problem is more pronounced on the House side than the Senate side. I think that they have had a thinning out of their ranks over there, not the members themselves, but some of the staff. And it may not even be in the offices, but it may be more like on committees. And, of course, you have the Congressional Research Service, which is part of the Library of Congress and other things. I'd have to look at those numbers to see how they're doing. But anyway, it's good point. I mean, good food for thought.
I mean, just as one thing that jumped out was the GAO between 1980 and 2015, the funding's been cut by a fifth. And for every $3,000 that's spent per person, only 6, in terms of government funding for all of our programs, only 6 is spent on oversight.
Yeah.
So it's hard to get those auditors in concert, working in concert. They're not there.
For those of you who can't hear on the webinar, he's talking about how basically, especially in relative terms, the GAO has gone through lots and lots of cuts and a shrinking budget over the last, say 25 years. And it shows. It really does. And we used to request GAO reports, and sometimes they usually get to them, but they take a long time, oftentimes, to get them turned around. And that's unfortunate because something could be pretty timely, and you're waiting on GAO, and, they just only have so many people over there to do it.
We only have a couple minutes. I'd like to get our panelists' thoughts really quick on how you mentioned it earlier, Senator Pryor, how the 2020 race might play into the next 2 years, 2020 presidential race. Any thoughts on how that actually might play out in terms of what gets done here in Washington and, how that might impact the nonprofit community?
I do think that, here we are 19 months away and we're already talking about 2020, but the whole country is. It's not just us. And people are looking at this very closely. And I think that President Trump has been a genius in being able to control the dialogue by using his tweets and Twitter and his other, sort of non-traditional ways that he communicates. I mean, he's been a genius about that. He's been keeping everyone off balance, and it's been pretty amazing to watch politically. But now he has a Democratic House, and the Democratic House will investigate, and they will not give him everything he wants as he's learning with this shutdown. And it's going to be interesting to see if he can change his tactics and see if he can be effective with a Congress that's divided. And I don't know if he can. But back on the 2020 race, you know, and I'm not kidding when I say we have about 25 Democrats that are running. Of course, not all of them officially, but, you know, rumored to be at least looking at it seriously. And now maybe one or more independents and other things like that. So it's going to be a little bit of a topsy-turvy political season. There will definitely be political motivations over in the House. There's no doubt about it. I mean, House and Senate both. No doubt about it. And there'll be political motivations in the administration, and that means in the agencies as well. No question about it. So I think that, you know, we're in for another kind of rough and tumble for the next 2 years and just see how it shakes out. I had a Republican lobbyist friend of mine come in the office today and say that he thinks there's no way that President Trump gets reelected. I can't say that. I think the Democrats have to come up with someone that can beat this guy. And there's a lot of good Democrats out there, but, you know, can they put it together to beat the guy? Certainly the Democrats are prone to nominate the wrong person to do that. They sometimes are prone to focus on issues that don't really move the needle that much. I think right now where the battle is politically is with those independent voters. Those folks who, many of them, not all, voted for Trump for whatever reason last time. It's like a cabbie. I had a cabbie the other day, and we were talking in the cab, and he said he voted for Trump last time, but he's counting the days until he can vote against him. Well, that's the kind of guy the Democratic Party wants to keep on their side. You know, however that happens in his world, they want to keep that voter on their side. So I think we're going to see a lot of politics get played over the next couple of years. I do think we cannot underestimate the Mueller investigation. Regardless of what all the politicians are doing and saying and however they're doing, it doesn't matter. The Mueller thing just keeps on plowing ahead. And rumor was yesterday that it's going to end soon, whatever that means. We've heard that before, but there's a new rumor that it's going to end soon. We were talking about some people that some of us know that are working on the investigation, and they hope it ends soon because it's an all-consuming deal. But you know, you got to keep a very close eye on that because that could change everything politically.
Andrea, any parting thoughts?
No, I agree. I think if we had a crystal ball, I think there are more Trump supporters out there than we all
there are.
Realize.
In my state, too. I mean, Arkansas voted heavily for Donald Trump.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of, and I think that the more politicized, frankly, the Congress is, the greater his chances of winning. Right, very frankly. So I think
that's a good observation. Yeah, that's right.
Because I think more people just say, "Forget this. We need somebody a little crazy."
Right. That's right. No, I think that's right.
So, on that positive note, for the nonprofit community, we really appreciate my panelists here today. Thank you for your time and your insight. Very wonderful to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And appreciate the nonprofit practice here at Venable for hosting us. There's been a lot of questions online about the Tax Cut and Jobs Act and how the new Congress might impact that. I'm going to mention to George Constantine, one of the co-heads of our group, to maybe put on a session specifically on that because I've got literally a dozen questions that I am not qualified to talk about. So I didn't answer any of those questions. So those of you listening on the phone that asked those questions, we'll see if we can't set up a lunch given the interest in how the TCJA may impact nonprofits in this new Congress. Thank you very much, and good luck with the weather. Stay warm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, just FYI, there's that. Yeah, that's great.